There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a Tuesday night that feels like any other Tuesday night, until it doesn't. They are the fault lines, the subtle shifts in the tectonic plates of your personal world that you only recognize in retrospect. For me, that shift sounded like a key in a lock, a sound that should have been mundane but instead carried the entire weight of a coming storm. It was Julian's key to my apartment, a symbol of a friendship so deeply entrenched that the normal boundaries of property and privacy had long since eroded into a comfortable, shared territory. But on that night, the sound was different. It was heavier, freighted with an energy that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up, a prelude to a change in atmospheric pressure that I had been sensing for weeks, a low hum of electricity in the air between us that I had desperately tried to ignore. The rain was hammering against the large, single-pane windows of my studio, a relentless percussion that seemed to be washing the city clean. I was sitting on my worn leather sofa, a book open in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in half an hour. My mind was on him, as it so often was. Julian. He was supposed to be in Chicago for a consulting gig, a whirlwind trip of meetings and presentations that usually left him drained and hollowed out. He wasn't due back until Friday. It was only Tuesday. The click of the lock turning was therefore an anomaly, a disruption to the established pattern of our lives, and my heart lurched into a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the carefully constructed dam I had built around my feelings was about to be tested. The door swung inward, and he was there, silhouetted for a moment against the slick, dark gleam of the hallway, looking less like a man and more like a ghost who had forgotten how to haunt properly. He didn't speak as he stepped inside, shrugging off a trench coat that was dark with rain and smelled of ozone and wet wool. He ran a hand through his hair, sending a spray of cold droplets across the entryway floor. I watched him, my body frozen in place, my book a dead weight on my legs. He looked utterly exhausted, but it was more than that. It was a profound weariness that seemed to have settled deep in his bones, a kind of soul-level fatigue that I had come to recognize in him over the past few months. His eyes, usually a bright, quick blue, were shadowed and storm-tossed, like a winter sea. He met my gaze from across the room, and in that single, silent look, 1,000 unspoken things passed between us. There was his loneliness, his confusion, his unspoken need. And reflecting it all back at him, I knew, was my own aching, patient, and hopelessly devoted love. The ordinary Tuesday was over. Something new was about to begin. To understand the weight of that moment, the sheer, terrifying gravity of him standing in my doorway on a night he should have been 1,000 miles away, you have to understand the foundation upon which we were built. Julian and I were a structure that had been assembled piece by piece over the better part of a decade. We met in college, two young men adrift in the overwhelming sea of newfound independence, and we latched onto each other like life rafts. I was a quiet art student, more comfortable behind a camera lens than in a crowded room, content to observe the world from a safe distance. He was a force of nature, a brilliant engineering major with a restless energy that propelled him through life, collecting friends and experiences like a magnet. On paper, we were an improbable pairing, the anchor and the tide. Yet it worked. He drew me out of my shell, and I gave him a place to be still. Our friendship was forged in late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee, in long drives with the windows down singing badly to the radio, in the shared vulnerability of figuring out who we were supposed to be. I became the curator of his memories, my camera always present, capturing the candid, unguarded moments he so rarely allowed himself. I have thousands of photographs of him from that time. Julian, laughing so hard he's doubled over. Julian, asleep on a pile of textbooks, the afternoon sun tracing patterns on his face. Julian, staring out at the ocean, his expression distant and thoughtful, a rare moment of introspection that I felt privileged to witness. I told myself I was documenting a friendship. I was, of course, documenting my own falling in love. It happened so slowly I didn't notice it at first, like the turning of a season, a gradual warming, a subtle shift in the light, until one day I looked at him and the platonic affection I held had bloomed into something deeper, more vibrant, and infinitely more dangerous. I was terrified. He was, for all intents and purposes, relentlessly, uncomplicatedly straight. He dated women, wonderful and beautiful women, with an easy charm that I both admired and envied. The longest and most serious of these was Sarah. She was kind and smart, and she loved him, and for 5 years, they were a unit. During that time, I perfected the role of the supportive best friend. I was the one he came to for relationship advice, the one who helped him pick out anniversary gifts, the one who listened patiently as he dissected their arguments and celebrated their reconciliations. I built walls around my heart, thick and high, and learned to live with the quiet ache in my chest that was his name. My feelings were a secret garden I tended to in private, a place of silent, beautiful melancholy that no one else was ever allowed to see. It was a lonely existence, but it was stable. I had his friendship, and I convinced myself that was enough. It was a precious, irreplaceable thing, and I would have done anything to protect it. Risking that for a love I was certain could never be returned felt like a form of madness, a self-destructive impulse I was determined to master. So I watched from my carefully constructed observation post, and I waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, exactly. Perhaps for the feeling to fade, for the ache to dull into a manageable scar. But it never did. It simply became a part of me, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface of my life. I poured it into my photography, into capturing the fragile, fleeting beauty of the world around me. I learned to find solace in the quiet click of a shutter, in the alchemy of the darkroom where I could bring images to light. My art became an exercise in seeing, in paying attention to the details others missed, and no subject was more detailed, more complex, or more captivating to me than him. I knew the way a stray lock of his hair would fall across his forehead when he was tired, the specific cadence of his footsteps in the hall, the way the corner of his mouth would twitch just before he was about to make a joke. I had cataloged a universe of small intimacies that he was completely unaware of, a secret language that only I could understand. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, grinding dissolution. It began with the end of him and Sarah. Their breakup wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was a quiet, sad erosion of a thing that had once been strong. He came to my apartment the night it ended, looking hollowed out, as if someone had scooped out his insides and left an empty shell. He didn't cry. He just sat on my sofa, the same sofa where I was now watching him years later, and stared at the opposite wall, speaking in a low, detached monotone. He spoke of misaligned futures, of a love that had become more habit than passion, of the terrible, gentle agony of letting go of someone who had been your home for so long. I listened, my heart breaking for him, a painful, genuine empathy warring with a tiny, monstrous spark of hope that I immediately hated myself for feeling. That night, he was too exhausted to drive back to the empty apartment he had once shared with her. He fell asleep right there on the couch, his head lolling to the side at an uncomfortable angle. I watched him for a long time in the dim light of the city filtering through the windows, his face vulnerable and unguarded in sleep. An overwhelming wave of tenderness washed over me, so potent it felt like a physical blow. I carefully lifted his legs onto the cushions, took off his shoes, and draped my favorite quilt over him, the one my grandmother had made. My fingers brushed against his hand, and the jolt of electricity was so intense I snatched my arm back as if I'd been burned. I retreated to my own bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the sound of his soft, even breathing from the other room, a sound that was both a comfort and a torment. It was the first time he had ever stayed the night. It would not be the last. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter, the establishment of a ritual that was as unspoken as it was sacred. His own apartment, now half empty and echoing with the ghost of a shared life, became unbearable to him. So, more often than not, he ended up at mine. At first, there were pretexts. He'd come over to watch a game, or to bring takeout, or to ask for my help with some mundane task. But these excuses became thinner and thinner until they disappeared altogether. He would just appear, often late at night after a long day at work, letting himself in with that key, his presence a silent question. And my answer was always the same. I would stop whatever I was doing, make him a cup of tea, and we would sit in the comfortable quiet that had always been the hallmark of our friendship. The couch became his default bed. He never asked. He just gravitated towards it. After a few weeks of this, I started leaving the quilt and a pillow folded at one end for him. It was an acknowledgement, a silent agreement that this was now part of our routine. I would say goodnight, retreat to my bedroom, and close the door, but I would leave it slightly ajar. A sliver of light from my reading lamp would cut across the dark floor of the living room, a beacon. I told myself it was in case he needed anything. But I knew, in the honest dark of my own room, that it was for me. It was a way of feeling less alone, of knowing he was close. I would lie in my bed, straining my ears to hear the small sounds of him settling in. The sigh, the rustle of the quilt, the quiet shift of his body, finding a comfortable position. These nights were a strange mix of peace and exquisite torture. Having him so close, so vulnerable, was a balm to the deepest parts of my loneliness. But the proximity, the knowledge that he was just a few feet away, sleeping in my space, under my grandmother's quilt, amplified my longing into a physical ache. I became a student of his sleeping habits. I learned that he sometimes mumbled fragments of words about deadlines and presentations. I learned that he kicked the quilt off when he got too warm, and I would often find myself creeping out of my room in the middle of the night to gently pull it back over him, my movements slow and careful, like a priest performing a rite. I would stand over him for a moment, my heart pounding, studying the peaceful expression on his face, the fan of his dark lashes against his cheek. It felt like a transgression, a theft of an intimacy I hadn't earned. I was living in a gray area, a liminal space between friendship and something more, and the ambiguity was starting to wear me down. I was a photographer accustomed to sharp focus, to clear lines and defined subjects. But my life with Julian had become a blur, a beautiful, heartbreaking image that I couldn't quite bring into focus. One night, about 2 months into this new arrangement, he came over later than usual. A storm was raging outside, a proper Midwestern thunderstorm with theatrical cracks of thunder and blinding flashes of lightning. He was soaked through, and his face was pale and drawn. He'd had a brutal week at work, and the exhaustion was rolling off him in waves. He changed into a set of my clothes, a soft gray sweatshirt and sweatpants that were a little too short on him, and collapsed onto the couch. I was sitting in my armchair, pretending to read. After a few minutes of silence, punctuated by the roar of the storm, he spoke, his voice low and raspy. "I hate the thunder," he said, not looking at me. "When I was a kid, I used to be terrified of it. I'd hide in my parents' bed. It was a small, vulnerable admission, but it felt like a door creaking open." I put my book down. "It's a pretty big one tonight," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Another long silence. The building groaned as a gust of wind hit it. Then, he said, "Leo?" "Yeah." He finally turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide in the gloom. "My couch is lonely," he said, and it was meant to be a joke, a deflection, but there was a tremor of something real and fragile underneath it. It wasn't his couch he was talking about. It was him. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. I knew what he was asking, without him having to say the words. This was a threshold. I could maintain the boundary, suggest he take my bed while I took the couch, preserve the careful distance I had cultivated for years. Or I could step across it. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to stay put, to protect myself from the inevitable pain of wanting more than I could have. But looking at his face, at the profound, aching loneliness in his eyes, I found that I couldn't. My own need for closeness, for the simple, human comfort of another body next to me in the dark, was just as strong as his. "My bed's bigger," I heard myself say, the words feeling foreign and momentous in my mouth. He didn't reply, but a visible wave of relief washed over his features. He stood up, and I stood up, and we walked the 10 feet to my bedroom in a silence that was thick with unspoken meaning. The room was dark, save for the intermittent, strobe-like flashes of lightning from outside. I got into my side of the bed, the side closest to the wall, and he hesitated for a moment before sliding in on the other side. The mattress dipped with his weight. He lay on his back, stiff as a board, with a chasm of at least 3 feet of empty space between us. I lay on my side, facing away from him, my whole body humming with a nervous energy. The air was electric, charged with more than just the storm outside. I was acutely aware of everything. The sound of his breathing, which was slightly too quick, the scent of my laundry detergent on the clothes he was wearing, the subtle warmth radiating from his body across the cold sheets. It was agonizing. We were two lonely islands in the same sea of mattress, terrified to bridge the gap. I don't know how long we lay like that, rigid and silent. An hour, maybe two. The storm began to subside, the thunder rumbling off into the distance. Then, I felt a slight shift in the bed. I held my breath. He had turned onto his side, facing my back. I could feel the heat of him, closer now. My back tingled where his body heat touched it. I wanted to turn over, to face him, to close the remaining distance, but I was paralyzed by fear. Fear of what it would mean. Fear of misreading everything. Fear of shattering the fragile piece of our friendship forever. So I just lay there, my muscles clenched, my heart a frantic bird in my ribs. After another eternity of silence, he whispered my name into the dark. "Leo, I'm awake," I whispered back, my voice barely a thread of sound. I felt his hand, hesitant at first, touch my shoulder. It was a light, questioning touch. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I just let it rest there, a small point of contact that felt like an anchor in a raging sea. His fingers were warm against the thin cotton of my t-shirt. Slowly, cautiously, he moved closer until his chest was pressed against my back, his knees tucking in behind mine. He draped his arm over my waist, his hand coming to rest on my stomach. His chin found the space between my shoulder blades, and he let out a long, shuddering breath, a sigh of such profound release that I felt it resonate through my entire body. And then, he was asleep. Just like that. His breathing deepened, his body went slack against mine, and he was gone. But I remained awake for hours, trapped in a state of suspended bliss and terror. He was holding me. Julian was holding me. It was everything I had ever wanted, a fantasy I had replayed in my mind 1,000,000 times, and it was happening. But it was built on a foundation of plausible deniability. He was tired. He was lonely. He was scared of the storm. It didn't have to mean what I wanted it to mean. It was a comfort he was seeking, not me specifically. I was just a warm body in the dark, a port in his personal storm. I repeated these rationalizations to myself like a mantra, trying to protect my heart from the hope that was blooming, wild and untamed, in the barren landscape of my chest. That night, the ritual of the couch was replaced by the far more intimate, far more dangerous ritual of the bed. This became our new normal, a silent arrangement that was never discussed in the light of day. On the nights he stayed over, which was most of them, we would end up in my bed. The pretense of the first night's storm was long gone, replaced by an unspoken mutual need. We developed a choreography. We would start on our respective sides of the bed, a respectable distance between us. But sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the night, drawn by some invisible, gravitational pull, we would find our way back to each other. Sometimes I would wake up to find his arm thrown over me, his face buried in my hair. Other times, I would be the one to turn and press myself against his back, seeking the steady, solid warmth of him. We never spoke of it. In the morning, we would wake up, untangle ourselves with a careful, almost formal politeness, and pretend that we hadn't just spent 8 hours wrapped around each other like vines. We would make coffee, talk about our plans for the day, and studiously ignore the profound intimacy that had passed between us in the dark. The duality of my life was tearing me apart. By night, I was living in a dream, holding the man I loved, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my back. By day, I was his friend, his roommate, his platonic confidant. I was an actor playing a part, and the performance was becoming more and more draining. I found myself overanalyzing every single interaction. A lingering look, a casual touch on the arm, a shared laugh. They all became data points that I would scrutinize for hours, trying to assemble them into a picture that made sense, a picture that confirmed my desperate hope. But the evidence was always inconclusive. He was tactile by nature, a physically affectionate person. I could never be sure if his actions were born of a deeper feeling or were simply an extension of the friendship we had always shared. He had built a fortress of ambiguity around himself, and I was trapped outside, unable to find a way in. And that brings us back to that Tuesday night. The night he was supposed to be in Chicago. The night he appeared in my doorway looking like a ship that had been lost at sea and had finally, miraculously, found its way back to the only harbor it knew. He dropped his bag by the door and walked slowly towards me, his stockinged feet silent on the hardwood floor. He didn't stop at the armchair opposite me. He kept coming until he was standing right in front of the sofa, looking down at me. "You're back early," I said, my voice sounding strained and unnatural to my own ears. "I finished up," he said, his voice quiet. "I took an earlier flight." He paused, his gaze fixed on my face. I didn't want to go home. To my place." "It's okay," I said. "You know it's always okay." He sank down onto the sofa next to me, not close enough to be touching, but close enough that I could feel the residual cold from the rain radiating off his clothes. We sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the drumming of the rain on the glass. I could feel the tension coiling in my stomach, a knot of anticipation and fear. Something was different tonight. The air was heavy with it. The usual, unspoken rules of our arrangement felt like they were about to be broken. "I'm so tired, Leo," he murmured, finally breaking the silence. He leaned his head back against the sofa cushions and closed his eyes. "I'm tired of everything." "I know," I said softly. And I did. I saw the toll the last few months had taken on him. The breakup, the pressure at work, the relentless loneliness he was trying so hard to outrun. He was running on fumes. He turned his head to look at me, his eyes still closed. Can we go to bed?" The question was so simple, so domestic, yet it sent a tremor through me. He wasn't asking to sleep. He was asking for refuge. I nodded, unable to speak. We went through our silent ritual. He changed into my clothes. I brushed my teeth. We slid into our respective sides of the bed. But tonight, there was no pretense of distance. The moment he was under the covers, he turned onto his side to face me, his body a hair's breadth from mine. The room was dark, but the ambient glow from the streetlights outside was enough for me to make out the details of his face. He was watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Talk to me," he whispered. "About anything. Your day, your photos. Just fill the space." So I did. I talked about the roll of film I had developed that afternoon, about the way the light had caught the dust motes in an old abandoned warehouse I had been exploring. I talked about the ridiculous email I'd gotten from a client, and the funny thing I had seen a dog do in the park. I spoke in a low, even monotone, my voice a thread in the darkness, and I felt him slowly begin to relax. His breathing deepened, and the tension in his shoulders seemed to melt away. He inched closer, his forehead coming to rest against mine. I could feel his breath, warm and soft, against my lips. My own breath hitched in my throat, and I fell silent. We stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, sharing the same small pocket of air, our gazes locked in the dim light. My heart was a thunderous, frantic thing, and I was sure he could hear it, could feel its vibration through the point of contact between us. This was the precipice. We had been walking along the edge of it for months, and now we were standing right at the brink. I felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of vertigo. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a universe of conflict in them. Fear and need, and a desperate, raw vulnerability that stripped away all of his usual defenses. His hand, which had been resting on the mattress between us, slowly lifted. I watched, mesmerized, as he reached for me. His fingers were hesitant, trembling slightly, as they brushed against the collar of my t-shirt. He didn't look away from my eyes. His gaze was unwavering, holding me captive. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers found the top button of the Henley I was wearing. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in the amber of that moment. He fumbled with the small plastic button for a second, his knuckles grazing the skin of my chest, sending sparks shooting through my entire nervous system. The button came free. He moved to the next one, his movements still slow, still achingly deliberate. All the while, his eyes never left mine. They were asking a question, a desperate, silent plea. "I'm straight, you know," he whispered, his voice a rough, broken thing in the profound quiet of the room. The words were a stark, brutal contradiction to the action his fingers were performing. It was a confession and a defense, a shield he was holding up even as he was lowering his sword. He undid the third button, his fingers now brushing against the bare skin over my sternum. My mind was reeling, a chaotic storm of confusion and pain and a wild, soaring hope. Why would he say that? Why now? Was this a warning? A rejection delivered in the cruelest possible way? I felt a cold dread begin to seep into my veins, threatening to extinguish the fragile flame of hope that his touch had ignited. I had to say something, but my throat was closed, my tongue thick and useless. He must have seen the conflict on my face, the hurt that was surely written there. He paused, his hand still resting on my chest, his thumb stroking my skin in a small, soothing circle that was completely at odds with the turmoil inside me. He swallowed hard, his own fear and confusion palpable in the small space between us. Then he asked the question that shattered everything. Does that matter right now? The words hung in the air, a genuine, desperate inquiry. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a manipulation. It was a plea for absolution, a plea to be allowed to exist in this one moment, untethered from the labels and expectations of the world outside this room, outside this bed. He was asking for permission to want me, without having to define what that wanting meant. He was asking if, just for tonight, we could be two people, two souls who had found a temporary solace in each other, and if that could be enough. And in that moment, looking into his storm-tossed eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand on my skin, all my years of patient waiting, of quiet aching, of carefully guarded love, coalesced into a single, simple answer. My own fear, my own hurt, my own need for certainty, it all fell away. All that was left was him. This broken, beautiful, confused man who had sought refuge with me, who was offering me the most vulnerable part of himself. I raised my own trembling hand and covered his, my fingers lacing through his on my chest. I gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. No, it didn't matter. Not right now. That small gesture was all the answer he needed. A wave of something, relief, gratitude, something I couldn't name, washed over his face. He leaned in, closing the final, infinitesimal distance between us, and his lips met mine. The kiss was not passionate or demanding. It was tentative, soft, a question. It was the taste of rain and exhaustion and a loneliness so profound it felt like a shared memory. It was a confession of everything he couldn't say, a surrender to a feeling that was bigger than his fear. I kissed him back with all the years of unspoken love I had held inside me, a gentle, overwhelming flood of acceptance. In the quiet of my bedroom, with the city sleeping around us, we crossed a line from which there was no return. And for the first time in a very, very long time, the frantic, humming anxiety in my chest went quiet, replaced by a profound and fragile peace. The aftermath was as brutal as the crossing had been tender. I woke the next morning to an empty space beside me. The indentation of his head was still on the pillow, the sheets were still warm, but Julian was gone. There was no note, just a text message sent at an hour when the sky was still a bruised purple, a time when only insomniacs and people fleeing the scene of a crime are awake. Something came up at work. Had to go in early. See you later. It was so jarringly normal, so utterly devoid of the monumental significance of the night we had shared, that it felt like a slap in the face. See you later, not we need to talk not about last night, just a casual, dismissive sign-off that attempted to erase the entire event. A cold, familiar dread began to pool in my stomach. I had allowed myself a few hours of unadulterated hope, a brief, sun-drenched fantasy of a new beginning. But the gray light of morning brought with it the harsh reality. He was panicking. He had stepped over a line he had drawn for himself, and now he was retreating as fast and as far as he could. The fortress of ambiguity he had lived in for months had been breached, and instead of walking out into the open, he was frantically trying to rebuild the walls, higher and thicker than before. The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxious waiting. I jumped every time my phone buzzed. I reread his curt text message 100 times, dissecting every word, trying to find a hidden meaning that wasn't there. The beautiful, honest silence we had created together had been replaced by a new kind, a loud, roaring silence filled with fear and regret. He didn't come over that night, or the next. My calls went to voicemail. My texts received brief, functional replies hours later. Busy at work, swamped, talk soon. I was being ghosted by the man who still had a key to my apartment, a man whose spare toothbrush was still in my bathroom. The whiplash was staggering. I felt foolish, naive. I had mistaken a moment of desperate, lonely weakness for a genuine change of heart. I had allowed his question, "Does that matter right now?" to feel like a permanent dispensation, when for him, it had clearly been a temporary one. As soon as right now was over, it started to matter a great deal. His label, his identity, his perception of himself, it all came rushing back in with the morning light, and it had obliterated me. The pain of it was a physical thing, a dull, constant ache behind my ribs. It was worse than the years of silent pining, because now I knew what I was missing. I had tasted it. I had felt the reality of his closeness, the mind-altering intimacy of his confession, and now the absence of it was a gaping wound. After a week of this agonizing distance, I knew I couldn't let it go on. The ambiguity was no longer a space I could inhabit. It had become a torture chamber. I needed clarity, even if that clarity was the confirmation of my worst fears. My own self-preservation, the part of me I had neglected for so long in favor of his comfort, was finally screaming for my attention. I couldn't live in the gray anymore. I needed to know if I was standing on solid ground or on a trapdoor. I sent him one last text. I'm not going to do this, Julian. We need to talk. Tonight. My place. There was no room for misinterpretation, no space for a flimsy excuse. It was an ultimatum, and it terrified me. But the fear of losing him was finally eclipsed by the fear of losing myself in this emotional limbo. He replied with a single word. Okay. He arrived at 7. He used his key, but he knocked first, a small, formal gesture that spoke volumes about the new distance between us. When I opened the door, he looked terrible. He was pale, there were dark circles under his eyes, and he held himself with a rigid tension, as if he were expecting a blow. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He walked into the living room and stood in the middle of the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, looking like a stranger in a place that had been his second home for years. I didn't offer him tea. I didn't ask him to sit down. I stood by the door, creating a closed circuit, a space he couldn't easily escape. What are you doing, Julian? I asked, my voice quiet but firm, stripped of all its usual warmth. He flinched. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a miserable, cornered panic. I don't know, he mumbled, staring at his feet. It's been a crazy week. Don't, I said, cutting him off. Don't you dare lie to me. Not about this. Not after that, the word that hung in the air between us, encompassing the kiss, the confession, the months of shared beds and unspoken intimacy. He started pacing, a caged animal, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of pure agitation. It was a mistake, Leo. I was exhausted. I wasn't thinking clearly. I messed up. I'm sorry. Every word was a hammer blow to my heart. A mistake. That's what I was. A moment of poor judgment. A mistake. I repeated, my voice dangerously low. You unbuttoned my shirt, Julian. You kissed me. You held me all night. That's a very detailed, very elaborate mistake. I'm straight, he burst out, the words loud and raw in the quiet apartment. He said it like an incantation, a ward against an evil spirit. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. You said that already. I shot back, my patience finally snapping. You said that while you were touching me, and then you asked if it mattered. So which is it? Does it matter, or doesn't it? Because it seems to matter a whole lot to you now. It matters so much that you can't even look at me. It matters so much you've spent a week treating me like I don't exist. He stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, covering his face with his hands. His shoulders were shaking. I don't know what's happening, he said, his voice muffled. I don't understand it. Everything is confused. I broke up with Sarah, and I felt nothing but relief. And then I started needing to be here. All the time. And I told myself it was just because you're my best friend. That it was just comfort. But that night, that wasn't just comfort, was it? No, I said softly, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a profound sadness for both of us. It wasn't. He dropped his hands and looked at me, his face a mask of anguish. But what does it mean? What am I supposed to do with that? My whole life, I've been one way. I love women. I do. And then, there's you. And it's different. It's quiet. It's not loud and dramatic. It's just this feeling of coming home. And it terrifies me. There it was. The truth. Not a rejection, but a confession of fear. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a feeling that threatened to upend his entire understanding of who he was. All the anger and hurt I had been carrying for a week dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so strong it almost brought me to my knees. He was just as lost as I was. I walked over to him, closing the space between us. I didn't touch him. I just stood in front of him, forcing him to see me, to see the reality of what was between us. Julian, I said, my voice gentle again. Look at me. The labels, the boxes, what you're supposed to be, none of that is as real as what you feel. What happened between us wasn't a mistake. It was the most honest thing that has happened in months. And it's scary. I know it's scary. It scares me too. But running from it, pretending it didn't happen, that's not going to work. It's just going to break both of us. Tears were silently tracking down his cheeks now. He didn't bother to wipe them away. I don't want to break us, he whispered. You're the most important person in my life. I can't lose you. Then stop running, I pleaded. Stop running, and just be here. With me. We can figure the rest out later. Or never. Maybe we don't need a label for it. Maybe we just need to be honest. He stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched on, thick with a decade of friendship and months of tension and 1 week of painful distance. I had laid all my cards on the table. There was nothing left for me to do but wait for him to play his hand. Finally, he gave a slow, weary nod. It wasn't a triumphant victory. It was a surrender to the truth. He reached out, his hand hesitating in the air for a moment before he gently cupped my cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear I hadn't even realized I'd shed. His touch was no longer a question. It was an answer. We didn't fall back into bed. The resolution wasn't that simple, that cinematic. The confrontation had drained us both, leaving us raw and exposed. Instead, we sat on the sofa, a careful foot of space between us, and we talked. Really talked, for the first time, without subtext or plausible deniability. He told me about the depth of his loneliness after Sarah, the feeling of being adrift without an anchor. He admitted that his relentless work schedule was a way of running from the quiet, from the questions he didn't want to face. He confessed that the comfort he found with me was different from any he had ever known, a sense of profound peace and rightness that he couldn't explain and that had frightened him with its intensity. I listened, and I shared my own truths. I told him about the years of loving him in silence, about the pain and the patience of it. I told him how his sudden need for closeness had been both a dream come true and a unique form of torture. I explained how his withdrawal after our kiss had felt like a fundamental betrayal of the trust we had built. We laid our vulnerabilities bare on the coffee table between us, two fragile, complicated hearts exposed in the soft lamplight of my living room. There were more tears from both of us, but they were cleansing tears, washing away the fear and confusion, leaving behind a clean, clear emotional space. By the time we were done talking, it was past midnight. An exhausted, fragile peace had settled over us. He looked at me, his eyes clear for the first time in weeks. "Can I stay?" he asked, and the question was different this time. It wasn't the plea of a desperate, lonely man seeking a warm body. It was a request from a partner, asking to share a space, to begin building something new and intentional. "Yes," I said. "Of course." That night, when we got into bed, there was no choreography of distance. We met in the middle of the mattress, our limbs tangling together naturally, easily. He pulled me against his chest, holding me close, his chin resting on the top of my head. I curled into him, my hand resting over his heart, feeling its slow, steady rhythm. There were no more questions, no more hesitations. It wasn't the frantic, desperate clinging of two lonely people in a storm. It was the quiet, settled embrace of two people who had found their harbor. I fell asleep almost instantly, a deep, dreamless sleep, feeling safer and more at home than I had ever felt in my entire life. The days that followed were a process of gentle rediscovery. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The big, scary questions about identity and the future still lingered on the horizon, but we made a silent pact to leave them there for a while. Our focus became smaller, more intimate. It was in the way he would now reach for my hand when we sat on the couch watching a movie. It was in the way I could now kiss him goodbye in the morning without a second thought. It was in the easy domesticity of making breakfast together, of sharing chores, of simply existing in the same space without any pretense. The grand, terrifying architecture of "what does this mean" was replaced by the simple, sturdy bricks and mortar of daily life, of small, consistent acts of love and care. His things began to migrate from his empty apartment to mine, slowly, organically. A box of books appeared one day, then his favorite coffee mug, then half of his closet. He never officially asked to move in. He just stayed. His key was no longer for emergencies or late-night refuge. It was the key to his home. And the door to my bedroom was no longer left ajar as a tentative beacon. It was closed, securing the private, shared world we were building within its walls. We were both on the same side of the threshold now. We learned that our love was a quiet thing, much like our friendship had been. It wasn't declarative or performative. It existed in the comfortable silences, in the shared glances, in the intuitive understanding of each other's moods. My camera, which had once been a tool for loving him from a distance, now captured our closeness. A photo of his hand resting on my knee as I drove. A shot of him, asleep in our bed, the morning light soft on his face, no longer a stolen, secret image but a cherished, shared reality. I was no longer just an observer of his life. I was a part of it, my frame intertwined with his. One Saturday afternoon, months later, we were lying on the living room floor, surrounded by stacks of my photo books. I was showing him some of my older work from college. He flipped a page, and there it was, a black and white photo of him, taken almost 10 years ago. He was leaning against a brick wall, laughing at something someone off camera had said. It was a perfect, unguarded moment of joy. He stared at it for a long time, a soft, nostalgic smile on his face. "You always saw me," he said quietly, his finger tracing the line of his own younger face on the page. "Even back then, you saw the parts of me I didn't even know were there." I leaned over and kissed his temple. "I was just paying attention," I said. He turned his head to look at me, his blue eyes full of a calm, certain love that no longer held any trace of fear or confusion. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You were." He closed the book and pulled me down to him, his arms wrapping around me tightly. "Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for waiting for me to catch up." We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together. We found that home wasn't a place with four walls and a roof, but a feeling of being seen, of being truly known. It was the safe harbor we built for each other, away from the storms of the outside world and the tempests within ourselves. The labels and definitions we had once feared so much seemed to matter less and less. He was Julian. I was Leo. And together, we were simply, finally, home. It turned out that what mattered right now was all that had ever really mattered at all.